But I just wanted to say deep, deep thanks for the invitation to be here. I thought it was going to be a welcome escape from the frigid temperatures up north. Everyone, when I left, goes, enjoy the warmth down south. And I said, I saw the forecast. I'll enjoy what I can. That being said, it's so good to be back in Louisiana, to be back in the South. There's so much about being down here that I've missed since moving to Canada. The people, interactions, the well-seasoned food, everything about it. It's just so nice to be back. So I am so deeply grateful for this invitation and to be here with you all tonight. I just want to say, if anyone is standing in the back and would like to take a seat, I'm going to be talking for a while. I can be long-winded, as my students well know. So feel free, get comfortable, take a seat, and then we can explore this history of the cocktail culture while we all sip on our own. And many thanks to Distillery Acadienne for providing these drinks. Absolutely. All right, cheers to everybody. Yes, if you have a glass, we'll take a little sip. All right. So as Adam mentioned, I study the history of alcohol. I, in particular, like to focus on that early history, early colonization, that moment when distillation became a mass-produced product for the very first time in humans, the entire existence of humanity. You know, people have been drinking alcohol as long as we know that humans have existed as a species. We believe, and there's evidence to suggest, that alcohol predates civilizations. And we know this because one of the very first pieces of written, any kind of written source documentation, cuneiform put into clay tablets, one of the first earliest discovered such tablets features basically a receipt for someone buying beer. And there are people who argue that one of the reasons why civilization and that process began is because people wanted to settle down, plant wheat, plant barley, or whatever they were growing so they could make alcohol. So I won't be so bold to say we had the agricultural revolution because people wanted a drink, but there are people who do make that argument. So nonetheless, we're not going to talk about antiquity, but we will begin with some of the earliest history and origins of Louisiana's settlement and how the drinking culture came to be introduced, how it evolved as Louisiana's history progressed, and how Louisiana, and in particular New Orleans, became so strongly associated with this cocktail culture. I like to refer to New Orleans as the cradle of the cocktail. Did it create it to begin with? We'll talk about that. People like to say so, but we'll see. Nonetheless, we do know that it is a city where this form of mixing and consuming, imbibing, and the celebration of doing so has grown and come into fruition in its own unique way. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, and my apologies, if this text is small, I will kind of go over all of these points. So if anyone in the back has a hard time reading that, no worries there. I will be sure to cover everything. Now, you all may be familiar with Louisiana's early history, its origins, but we can thank Frenchman René Robert Cavelier for, let me get his full title in there. René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle for claiming the land that becomes Louisiana. And he's going to ascribe that name to the territory. He arrived in what people refer to as New France, first landing outside of Montreal. So again, another little Canada connection. But he landed outside of Montreal in 1667. His goal was to find a route to China, as all your early European explorers were trying to do. They wanted access to those eastern markets. He unfortunately never found China, but fortunately for the rest of us, he did make his way down the Mississippi River. And he did so a decade after first making his way to what is now Canada. It took him about a decade maneuvering around that territory to gain necessary experience to navigate waterways. He also became familiar with and got to know and learned a lot from indigenous communities around the area, which helped inform his future travels down the Mississippi. And he became interested in traveling down the Mississippi. And this is a map from kind of mid-18th century showing Louisiana, what was kind of that Louisiana territory. He became interested in sailing down the Mississippi because prior to his voyages, there was an attempted expedition led by Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, which occurred in 1678. They wanted to find a way to connect their own travels from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico. They didn't make it. But they found out really important information that La Salle was able to put to use. So their goal was to connect all of French Canada settlement with this broader territory and ideally find a easy pathway to the Caribbean, where France was also establishing itself as a colonial power. So February 1682, La Salle is going to begin canoeing down the Mississippi. You can imagine that. That's a preferred mode of transportation. He had a small group with him, so he was not by himself. He began in February, and he did successfully reach the Gulf of Mexico in April. So it took a few months, but he did make it. And in the course of those travels, he was able to lay claim to the entire watershed of the Mississippi River, which he called La Louisiane, in honor of Louis XIV. So that will give France claim to this entire area, this entire territory, because they say any waterway, tributary, or river that flows into the Mississippi River, that belongs to France too. How convenient. Well, we'll fast forward a little bit. So that's how we get to New France. That's how we get Louisiana. Fast forwarding a little bit to the future, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, or Bienville, as we like to say, he joined his brother Pierre Lemoyne Sieur d'Iberville, or Iberville, as we say today. They are looking to establish colonial settlements across this Louisiana territory. They're going to be responsible for founding Baton Rouge by sticking a red stick into the ground. Baton Rouge, quite literally. But they will also be responsible for founding what becomes New Orleans in 1718. They picked a location, and you all may be familiar with this, in that crescent of the Mississippi River, which they saw or believed would protect it from tidal surges and hurricanes. Nonetheless. Yeah, you know, the best laid plans. Nonetheless, that's why they planted the first colonial settlement there. 1720 through 1721, an engineer, Adrien de Pouget, drew up plans for this new city, a rectangular 11 block by 7 block settlement that is today's French Quarter. Bienville's going to name it La Nouvelle Orléans in honor of Philippe, Duke of Orleans. And by 1723, this will become the capital of French Louisiana. So that's how we get to where we're going to be, and that's how we got to where we are today. So any questions about that? The teacher in me is just like, before I go to the next slide. Yeah, just you wait. I'm gonna want 700 words about. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So now that we have New Orleans established, we have Louisiana and New France. France is interested in cutting into the profits won and that is currently being won by the Spanish Empire. So colonization is a competition, and different European powers want to cash in at the intentional expense of their rivals. So they want to use New Orleans in particular as a base to kind of go at the Spanish, similarly to how they used Tortuga, the island of Tortuga in the Caribbean, to kind of needle their way into the western third of the Spanish colony of Hispaniola, and they'll later claim that as the French colony of Saint-Domingue will later become Haiti. But as a result of this intention, early settlers of New Orleans included professional privateers, experienced smugglers, of course traders, and inevitably enslaved peoples from Africa, and they will all inhabit this area around and with the indigenous population who already lived there. New Orleans will also become a popular destination for convicts sent from France. So we have ourselves a different cocktail of sorts coming together in the earliest settlement of this colony. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't take much time for New Orleans to get a reputation for being a bit of a wild town, a wild settlement. By the 1720s, French writers are describing Louisiana as a failure. The Crown's reaction is to recommend abandonment. It's already a lost cause. By the 1720s, they didn't even make it a decade. One Jesuit traveler, Père Charlevoix, described New Orleans as a disappointment, inflated by over-ambitious plans. And another visitor to the city in 1730 wrote, quote, "Disorders are so frequent in this colony, and vice here triumphs unpunished." We love to keep traditions alive. Nothing changes. The more you study history, the more you learn. Everything is just the same. In fact, one young Ursuline nun named Marie Hachard, who arrived in New Orleans in 1727, was absolutely stunned when she first took in this colonial city, and in particular was shocked by the colonists' penchant for disorder and corrupt moral economy. And she wrote of the settlement, quote, "The devil here possesses a large empire." So these descriptions, they do come, from this perspective of a pre-revolutionary France, a society and culture that's informed by the Ancien Regime, which lasted roughly from the 15th century until the fall of the monarchy in 1789. So this is a feudal society in which people are kind of perceiving and taking in what they're observing. They are expecting to see a society in which people understand their place and people show deference to their quote-unquote social betters. That isn't happening in New Orleans, much to many people's disappointment. But for New Orleanians of this French colonial period, they were not only known for being rule breakers, but they kind of prided themselves on being so. They were independent-minded and resourceful, especially when it comes to finding ways to survive. A mentality and a tradition, also a legacy that has persisted to this day. You're sitting here going, okay, this is great. Where's the alcohol? Well, this is not going to surprise anybody, but the French transferred their own drinking cultures from the very beginning that this colonial city was planted. Now, this presented a number of challenges for the French, however, because what do the French love to drink more than anything else but wine? Absolutely. Vineyards don't grow so well in a swamp. It's not the right climate, nor is it a good environment for it. Also, wine had a tendency to go bad on that transatlantic voyage, which at the time took a few weeks to complete. So they had to find a way to fortify that wine so it would survive that voyage and perhaps survive long enough that they could import goods for the colonists to buy and drink. So let's get into distillation. So when we have this history of wine drinking in France, it has ancient roots. The Romans, when they invaded and conquered Gaul, the ancient name for what became France, they noted the popularity of cultivating vineyards for the purpose of making and drinking wine. So this is a very old tradition, and it carried on and persisted through the activities of monks running monasteries. Distillation won't have its origins in France, but it will become crucially important to winemakers in that region. Distillation itself and the knowledge that Europeans gain from distillation will come from the Middle East. It will come from Muslim chemists who learned the correct temperature needed in order to separate alcoholic vapors from water and any other materials that it might be contained within. Because they learned that alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than water. So if you heat these mixtures correctly, you can separate the alcohol from everything else, leaving yourself with a more condensed, more highly potent concentration of an alcoholic drink. So circa the 8th century is when we think this knowledge was developed, around the Middle to Near East. It's going to take 8 more centuries before the Europeans get access to this knowledge. So it's about the 16th century when Europeans start to learn about and develop the skills needed to distill wine. And that knowledge, once it reaches these French winemakers, becomes crucially important because they can now take wine that might not have been of a good enough quality to sell as wine and distill it down and sell that as brandy. Brandy it does come from a Dutch word because the Dutch helped popularize and spread this practice. So it comes from the Dutch word brandewijn, which means burnt wine. So that's where we get brandy from, and it became widely popular across France. And it became attractive for many of these French vintners who are looking for another way to make a little extra money off of what they're making. So distilling batches of inferior wine, you end up with a product that you can charge a lot more money for. It's a more precious commodity. But it is also something that is more stable, and it has a longer shelf life. So it's well suited for these transatlantic voyages, and it's not long before brandy imports make their way to New Orleans. So brandy becomes a popular drink of the colonial period. It becomes a favorite distilled spirit for those French colonists. It's going to be more accessible and more widely consumed than other distilled spirits produced at that time in the Caribbean. They're making a lot of rum. In time, rum will start making its way to New Orleans. Whiskey will also come later, and we'll talk about that. But I just want to note very quickly, the folks in the back may not be able to see this image very well. But this is from John Greenwood's Sea Captains Carousing in Suriname, which was a Dutch colony at the time, circa 1752. And in this, you just see a scene of absolute chaos and mayhem. I highly recommend looking at this image in detail because there's so much going on. I was deeply fortunate to see the original of this painting, and it took up it would fit across that entire wall, across the side of this room. It's huge. But within it, you can see individuals who are a little too far gone, already done for the night. This is my favorite person in it, who is throwing up into his friend's pocket while he's setting himself on fire. Yeah. So you see, it's just broken bottles, there, chairs on the floor, people passed out in the corner, card games, more vomiting, so much vomiting. It's a Friday night on Bourbon Street. So this becomes a very common scene across colonial settlements, but especially in places like New Orleans. And again, what's changed? Now, I do want to talk a little bit about rum production because with my research, I focus, I would say, primarily on rum. This is happening across the Caribbean, and rum will become the first mass-produced distilled spirit. The brandy trade is the earliest and the oldest of the spirits in terms of commodifying these potent alcoholic drinks. Rum will be mass-produced on a scale that brandy never obtained before this point. And that's as a result of colonization and the spread of the sugar colonies. Sugar is the most prized good. It's white gold at this era of colonial history and competition. The Spanish, the French, and the English are all going to head, never mind the Portuguese, who will take over Brazil and turn Brazil into a wide array of sugar plantations. And it's all made possible through the exploitation of enslaved labor. But this process of making rum, it's an unexpected and kind of unplanned byproduct of the sugar industry as it develops. Because as people are cutting down these sugar cane stalks, they have to process them immediately. Because as soon as sugar cane juice becomes exposed to the air, it starts to ferment. There's so much sugar content and yeast floats in the air, it just starts to ferment automatically. And it'll go bad. You can't process sugar out of it. So it's a non-stop operation, and it's kind of a pre-industrial system that spreads across these sugar colonies. Now, in making sugar, they cut down all of these stalks, they'll extract the sugarcane juice running through these rollers that press them out, and then they boil down all of the moisture so they can get to the granular sugar, right? Well, when you do this, there's this sticky syrup that gets left behind. So they put all this sugar into these kind of clay cylinder cone-shaped molds. And there's a hole in the bottom. And they do that for the purpose of that syrup so it can drain out. Now, sugar planters are only interested in this. So here's all of this sticky, syrupy, leftover remnants that they said, just it's trash, throw it away. And then enslaved laborers started to say, could we keep this and use it? Planters were just throwing it into the ocean. So they said, sure, we don't care. And then they started to notice that enslaved laborers mixing that molasses with a little bit of water, it ferments and becomes molasses beer. So they were drinking this and enjoying it, a refreshing drink in the midst of the excruciating labor in the hot tropical sun. And the planter said, maybe we can make money off that too. And sure enough, that's how we see the emergence of the rum industry in the Caribbean. The Dutch will teach the English how to distill molasses into rum for the purpose of sticking it to the Portuguese, because Portugal kicked the Dutch out of Brazil and Barbados, and then of course the French Caribbean colonies will become major producers of rum. And because of the scale of sugar production that's happening, which is massive, hundreds of thousands of pounds of sugar coming out of these islands every single month. Not even every single year, just every single month. Add to that much rum being distilled in addition to that. People don't have a lot of experience drinking highly potent alcoholic drinks, and that's how you end up with scenes like this. So people did learn very quickly the need to cut these spirits with other things to make it less potent, to make it more manageable, to try and avoid throwing up in your friend's pocket. So even in the Caribbean, they start mixing rum with a little bit of water, citrus fruit juices, oranges, limes, lemons, creating the very first rum punches. And throw some sugar in there because you have so much of it on hand. And if anyone wants, here's an old rhyme from the 18th century. It's an old recipe rhyme, so you can take this home with you and make your own rum punch circa colonial era style. So it's, I don't know if anyone wants to write this down. All right, everyone's taking out their notes. Yes, yes, yes. So it's 1 part, do I have this written down so I don't get it wrong? 1 part sour. 1 part sour. So your lime juice, lemon juice, whatever. 2 parts sweet, that's your sugar. 3 parts strong, rum. And 4 parts weak, and that's how much water they would usually add. So 1 part sour, 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak. I've made this. It's a sneaky drink. I know how they got there. And it just for a little extra 18th century style, they love to just grate a bit of fresh nutmeg on top. They loved fresh nutmeg on top of all of their drinks. I don't know why. That's optional. So, yeah, 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak. All right. Never have I seen my students take such diligent notes as when I share that with them. All right. So I'll take the pictures down for now, and I'm going to talk to you now about origin of the cocktail, right, as we know it. We can already see with this early colonial history how people are playing with these drinks and the flavors that fit well with them. You know, they recognize rum goes well with these fruit citrus juices that were abundant and accessible, and it tasted good when you mixed it together. Now, when we talk about the origin of the cocktail, there's a very popular story told in New Orleans. You may have heard it walking around the city. Tour guides love to tell this story. It takes everything. When I lived in New Orleans, it took everything I had to just not go. It's a very popular story. But it's based off this tale of a migrant from the French Caribbean, a man named Antoine Peychaud, who made his way to New Orleans to set up his apothecary shop. And when he set up that shop, he would sell these drink mixtures that he would take some brandy and, of course, his now famous Peychaud bitters, and he would mix up these concoctions in a French cup called a coquetier, an egg cup. And the corruption of that word is where we get the word cocktail. If something fits a little too nice and is a little too cute, it's probably not true. And we know this because the first documented appearance of the word cocktail appeared in a New York newspaper. The newspaper's name was the Balance and Columbian Repository. But published on May 13th, 1806, the editor responded to a question received, "What is a cocktail?" This person says, "I'm hearing this word. What is it?" And to that question, the editor said, "A cocktail is a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. It is vulgari." Wow, that just doesn't roll off the tongue. My goodness. Maybe it's those nice cocktails we had before the talk. Vulgarly called a bittered sling. And it is supposed to be an excellent electioneering potion, inasmuch as it renders the heart stout and bold, And at the same time, it fuddles the head. Yeah, nail on the head, and also makes certain words a little difficult to pronounce, my goodness. That posting came out, as I mentioned, 1806. Antoine Peychaud was believed to have been born in 1803. So unless he was a very ambitious and industrious 3-year-old, I don't think he's mixing up drinks in his apothecary shop. So what this tells us is we don't actually know the exact origin of a cocktail or this term. It gives us the fact that they are receiving this question and editors responding to it in 1806 means it probably came out around the turn of the 19th century. But that's the earliest documented use we see of it, and it's in response to a question. So my apologies to Antoine Peychaud, but this is one aspect of, again, a very important legacy that we can celebrate, but that is not, sadly, part of it. But early versions of cocktails began to grow and evolve across early 19th century New Orleans. And this is also going to be affected by that late 18th century influx of people fleeing the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which was in the midst of the Haitian Revolution. Antoine Peychaud was believed to have been a part of that migration wave because the Haitian Revolution will last 13 years in total. And it's estimated that people who tended to target New Orleans because of its French history, similar climate, and the already pre-existent sugar industry which was established there. It's estimated that by 1809, roughly 10,000 French, am I on the right one? No, am I ahead of myself? There we go. There we go. Estimated by 1809, roughly 10,000 French colonists left Saint-Domingue for New Orleans. So we see this massive influx and migration. Now, Peychaud himself, whose exact arrival into New Orleans is a little fuzzy. I mentioned he established an apothecary shop. He worked as a druggist. His pharmacy was set up at 90 Royal Street in 1841. Today it is a place where you can buy antique guns and coins. But it's there that he developed his now famous mixture of herbs and distilled spirits that is still available to buy under his name, Peychaud Bitters. Initially, these style of bitters were used in mixtures for the purpose of making drinks that would cure ailments. That's why you go to your pharmacist to get a drink. To your health, right? So this is one of the more traditional uses of alcohol in one area that I've been fascinated by, this kind of overlap with the medical side of drinking. Now, Peychaud's not the only pharmacist who is going to be responsible for contributing to this creation of mixed drinks, creating their own bitters, selling these mixtures out of their own apothecaries. He's one man in a very long history and an old tradition of pharmacists creating these mixtures to sell to their consumers. Now, brandy is the spirit of choice at this time, in around the 1840s. And Peychaud gained some popularity. He became known in the area for making a good and healthy tonic, you know. You go to Peychaud's apothecary for that mixed drink, brandy, Peychaud bitters, and whatever else he might add to it, you know, to help you feel better. Now, in 1840, a man named Sewell Taylor is going to set up the Merchants Exchange Coffee House around the vicinity of 17 Royal Street. And this is going to become a very popular coffee house in the city. But they will also import and sell different brands of brandy, bringing in these brandies from France, selling them to their consumers. And this included one called Sazerac de Forges et Fils. So Taylor, he establishes himself. This drink gains some popularity and notoriety. In 1850 or thereabouts, he sells this coffee house to a man named Aaron Bird. And he's going to be an important figure in the development of what we now know as New Orleans' favorite cocktail. Brandy and bitters was a popular mixture in New Orleans by this time. At his newly purchased Exchange Coffee House, Bird saw to it that they used that Sazerac brand of brandy exclusively, mixing it with the much beloved and popular Peychaud bitters, sold up the street. How convenient. It became so popular, this mixture, that by 1852, Bird changed the name of his coffee house to the Sazerac Coffee House. And he's starting to cement a legacy that continues to this day. Now, the Sazerac Coffee House had a reputation for this 125-foot bar. I can't even picture it, but I wish I could have seen it. It could fit 12 bartenders behind it at a time. This was a part of the showmanship, but it also speaks to the demand. How else and why else would you have 12 bartenders if only one person's ordering a drink at a time? This is how popular these Sazerac mixtures were becoming. This is going to become a part of the cocktail making process around the latter half of the 19th century. Now, Bird will sell his Sazerac Coffee House in 1870 to a man named Thomas Handy, who was an entrepreneur, and he had his background in the liquor industry. He will gain the exclusive rights to Peychaud's bitters in 1873, tying them for their exclusive use in this brandy mixture. But wait a second, you may say, hang on, I've had Sazeracs. They're not made with brandy. What are they made with? Rye whiskey, absolutely. Why aren't they made with brandy today? We can thank a little bug, an aphid, the Phylloxera vastrix. So you can see here on the slide. This is an aphid that took over and destroyed all of the French wine crops during the late 19th century. It devastates the French wine industry and almost upends the French brandy industry entirely. By 1890, about 2/3 of all vineyards across Europe were infested or destroyed. Well, one little bug. So there was no brandy. But Thomas Handy has this really popular establishment. He has a consumer base. He needs to meet this demand. Brandy's not around, but what is? American whiskey. So he, American-made whiskey, just swap it in. That fills the brandy void. So by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, Sazeracs are made with whiskey, and they continue to be so to this day. So that's how we get ourselves to the Sazerac. Yeah. Now, just to elaborate on this, and this history of Sazeracs is far from a mixture of just brandy or whiskey and bitters, of course, today. Cocktails became more and more common in people's expected drinking repertoire. And we can see by the early 20th century a new kind of mixology starting to take shape. By the early 20th century is when absinthe is first added to this Sazerac cocktail recipe. It was already a popular and kind of established liquor in New Orleans. It seemed to complement the flavors of the whiskey and the bitters. Of course, after absinthe was made illegal, it's basically replaced with a wormwood-free herb saint. So that slips in. So the ingenuity. People always responding to these new challenges that come their way. So this is just one example of the kind of elaboration that occurs to people's history and lives with drinking and alcohol. Now, I just have a few more examples, and I'm just kind of hitting some highlights here. And this is one of the reasons why I like to call New Orleans the cradle of the cocktail, because it is the site of that ingenuity, and it's very reflective of how people were creative in making these new and now very popular drinks. A few cocktails that absolutely did come from the city of New Orleans. 1888, saloon keeper Henry C. Ramos developed an intricate new cocktail, which is a good description of and captures how far cocktails came in this time period, since that colonial era. We don't just have, it's not 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak. It's not that. No. We have gin, sugar, cream, lemon juice, lime juice, throw in an egg white, orange flower water, and put a little soda water on top. Oh, and shake that thing as long as your arms will allow you to go. Cocktail myth and lore claims that bartenders shook it for 12 minutes, which seems excessive. Also, are you sitting there for 12 minutes going, where is my drink? But he supposedly set up an assembly line of shaker boys so they could just and the whole time you're just going, my drink is getting farther away. But again, that showmanship, right? It's all about the display, a part of mixology that still carries on to today. Now in the US, we had this little thing called the temperance movement. People who believed life and society would be far better without alcohol in it, increasingly calling for the complete removal of alcohol from society, somehow winning a vote in Congress, amending the Constitution. However, it got through. I can't even imagine them, they can barely pass a bill today. How can they amend the Constitution? And they won't do so once, but twice in regard to alcohol. But 1919, we have the onslaught of prohibition, of course, the Volstead Act, which gives that 18th Amendment its teeth. New Orleans will not be stopped, even in the face of prohibition. People do love to tell the stories of how quickly these agents from the Prohibition Bureau, how long it took, they travel around the country, how long does it take to get access to a drink? New Orleans was the fastest, because when the guy arrived in the city and got in a cab, he said, where can I find a drink? And apparently the cabbie pulled a bottle out from under his seat. They won that race. Now, how is this going to affect these saloons? Prohibition kills the saloon. We don't have saloons today because of it. Now, Henry Ramos himself was known as being a temperate man, even though he came up with a classic New Orleans cocktail. He abided by the law and shut his saloon down to be in full compliance. He was supposedly so well known as being a temperate man that when Carrie Nation, a woman, a temperance advocate known for visiting saloons with a hatchet in which she would destroy it and as many bottles as possible, spared his saloon when she made her trip to New Orleans. Nonetheless, that 13-year-long noble experiment, as it was known, did not slow New Orleans down. Thankfully, that law was repealed with the 21st Amendment, and legal drinking was allowed to continue once again. However, the alcohol industry was in a bit of dire straits. Many distilleries were just fully out of business. They've been closed for 13 years. We saw the effects of COVID and the pandemic, which was a much shorter window of time, and many establishments closed as a result. Well, with World War II, we had a new need for people to drink yet again. Alcohol industry will revive itself in response to this massive conflict. But whiskey production had not rebounded yet because of prohibition. But what didn't stop was all that rum being produced in the Caribbean. And a lot more Americans were becoming familiar with these tropical style drinks. So World War II era is when we see the creation and emergence of the hurricane, made at Pat O'Brien's bar, initially located around 1718 St. Peter Street. Sorry, the 600 block of St. Peter Street. It then later moved to 1718 St. Peter Street, where it stands today. So around the 1940s, the hurricane cocktail emerged. Rum drinks became popular again. Fruity, kind of intricate style cocktails came on the scene. And of course, a hurricane, which is made distinguished by its style of glass based off of a hurricane lamp, is what gives it its name and signature look. And again, it speaks to how cocktails have become developed, because we have light rum, dark rum, lime juice, passion fruit juice, simple syrup, grenadine, and then the garnish. So all this to say, we can see how far cocktails have come. But you all have been sipping on some old fashions before we started today. What makes an old fashioned old fashioned? What's in a name? It's in response to this elaboration of cocktails that took place over the 19th and into the 20th century. It's a drink that calls back to those kind of old colonial style bittered slings, the style that someone like Antoine Peychaud would have been selling out of his apothecary shop. And old fashioned is a simple mixture of liquor, usually whiskey, but it can be brandy if you would like it to be, a little bit of sugar, and some bitters. It's first mentioned in print in 1880, and it was in reference to that old-fashioned style of drinking that had since seemingly gone out of favor. Now, just a few concluding words as I wrap this up. The very limited number of famous cocktails born out of New Orleans that I've highlighted here today, and I just want to clarify, old-fashioned is not from New Orleans, but it speaks to and ties into this history. I just don't want to confuse anything on that front. But of the famous cocktails discussed that did come from New Orleans, serving as a product and a contributor to not only the drinking culture of the city, but kind of the broader culture of the region that's celebrated and recognized to this day. This emerged from the very beginning. We see from those early colonists, those rowdy, debased and immoral colonists who established that devil's empire. Drinking has been prominent and a favored pastime in this part of the world since its colonial origins. And people continue to visit New Orleans to this day, and Louisiana in general, just to get a taste of this famous cocktail culture and to experience the city and the history that bore them, sometimes in the very establishments in which they were first made. So New Orleans may not have invented the cocktail, but bartenders in the city did craft numerous unforgettable and legendary recipes that have helped make that local drinking culture truly timeless. Thank you very much.